Hi guys, and welcome back. So in this video, we're just going to set up a basic cluster. I'm going to spin up a couple of virtual machines here. We'll create a master node and then a couple of worker nodes here and join those onto the master node. So we'll do a little bit of virtual machine setup process, but I did want to point you over to a document. I meant to mention this in the last video, but there's a really good document over on the Kubernetes documentation under tasks, under administering a cluster, administration with kubeadm specifically, and then there's a document called upgrading kubeadm clusters, and this is what talks about how you can upgrade your cluster from version to version. So, this kind of shows you what the high level process is. You kind of start by updating a primary control plane or master node, then you upgrade all of the other master nodes in your cluster. In this case, we're just going to have one, so we're just going to have step one here, and then we'll kind of skip over step two because we don't have any additional master nodes. And then the final step in the process is to upgrade those worker nodes, get that kubelet service upgraded so that it's in line with your cluster version. So what we're going to do is actually jump back over to installing kubeadm. So let's search for kubeadm here. And we're just going to look for installing kubeadm. And we're going to follow these steps really quickly just to set up our virtual machines. But for now, what I'm going to do is actually bring my AWS Management Console over here. And I'm going to go ahead and launch a couple of new virtual machines here for this particular purpose. So I'm going to be using, let's find Ubuntu Linux here. There it is. Let me hide my video. And then we're going to just choose some relatively small instance types here. I think a T3 small should be plenty with 2 vCPUs and 2 gigs of RAM. If you're using a different cloud vendor, feel free to choose a different one. I'm going to tell it to spin up 3 instances here, and then we'll go ahead and just go next. I'm going to provision 15 gigs of storage just to make sure we have enough storage on each of them. I'm going to make sure I have inbound SSH access using my security group firewall rules, and then we'll go ahead and launch. Now, once these virtual machines are launched, I'm just going to go ahead and give them some names just so that I can easily identify which one is which. And if your cloud vendor allows you to just rename those virtual machines, you can go ahead and just give them some names. I'm just going to pick one here, and I'm going to call this Master01. And then I'll pick another one and call this Worker01. And then I'll pick the third one, and we'll call that Worker03. So now we're going to basically SSH into each of these virtual machines, and we'll do the initial cluster setup process on there. So I'll do SSH-O server live interval equals 60, and then I'll say Ubuntu at IP address. And the server alive interval option that I'm doing there basically just helps keep my SSH connection persistent in the event that I have an unstable internet connection. So that's just kind of a nice convenience there. So this is going to be our, let's see, this is our master node, right? So I'm actually going to rename him for starters. So I'll do sudo vim etc hostname, and we'll go ahead and just give it a name like master01, just so we can easily identify that in our cluster. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a sudo-es here, and I'm going to get the basic components installed. So let me bring this browser with my documentation right here. Here's my documentation. Let me bring this other browser, and we'll just kind of merge those together so we can easily switch between these tabs. And what we're going to do is be running these different commands to basically just set up the virtual machine for Kubernetes first. So one of the commands we'll need to run here is to ensure that the network bridging filter is installed. I'm going to go ahead and run that on this guy here. All right, good. And then we're going to go ahead and install the Docker runtime here. So I'm going to do an apt update apt install docker.io. --yes, that'll get the Docker runtime installed. And then one other thing we're going to need to do is to configure the Docker runtime for cgroup fs. So if we just do a search for cgroup fs on Docker here, we want to add in this option here into our Docker configuration for systemd. So once Docker is finished installing, we'll actually edit the systemd unit file for it to add in this option right here. So let's do vim lib systemd system docker.service. And then under the exec start here, I'm just going to jump to the end and say exec opt and paste this in. I think that ought to work. So let's just save that, and then I'll just do a reboot since we've renamed it and reconfigured the Docker daemon. And then we're going to follow similar steps for our other virtual machines here as well. So let's get SSH'd into worker 01. So let's find his IP address. So here's worker 01, and it looks like I named that worker 03. That's actually supposed to be worker 02. Let's fix that really quick. All right, so let's SSH into worker 01 here. And we'll do the same thing. We'll do sudo -es, and then we'll do apt update, apt install docker.io. And once the Docker engine is installed, we can go ahead and run the command to configure the bridging filter as well. And then I'm going to SSH into worker 02 here, and we'll do the same thing. All right, so let's get Docker installed, sudo -es. We'll do apt update, apt install docker.io, yes. And then back here on our master node, we'll get SSH'd back into him, and we'll come back to him in just a second, but I'm going to go ahead and rename the worker 01 here. So we'll call this worker 01 and save. And then we also need to configure the Docker engine to use cgroupfs here as well. Let's do vim lib systemd /system/docker.service. Go down to the exec start line, go to the end, and do exec opt and paste in. Whoops, that's the IP address. I need to grab native.cgroup driver equals systemd. We'll save that, and we'll go ahead and reboot. And we're going to do the same thing on this one down here, worker 02. We'll do vim etc hostname, say worker 02. And then we're going to go ahead and reconfigure the Docker engine. So we'll do var or vim lib systemd /system/docker.service. Go down to exec start, go to the end, and add exec opt and paste that option in. And then we'll go ahead and just do a reboot here. And once all of these VMs are rebooted, we should be able to confirm that the Docker daemon has been reconfigured by running docker info. And when we run docker info, we should see that the cgroup driver is set to systemd. Awesome. So that's fine on our master node here. Let's go ahead and try the same thing on our other nodes here. So on worker 01, we'll do sudo -es, and we'll do docker info. And let's find the cgroup driver, systemd, looks good. And then finally, on worker 02, we'll go ahead and do the same thing, sudo -es, and say docker info, and confirm that cgroup driver is systemd. Okay, great. Those are all good. So now I'm going to go ahead and paste in the command here to configure the traffic forwarding. So I'll do that on worker 02 and worker 01. And we already did that on the master node, so we don't need to worry about it there. And so now we've got these all consistently configured with the Docker engine using systemd as the cgroupfs driver. So let's head back over to our docs here. And now what we want to do is install the kubeadm, kubelet, and kubectl packages. However, we want to intentionally install an older version of these packages. So the first thing that we're going to do before we actually install the packages themselves, which we'll do right down here under step number 4, but before we do that, we're just going to set up the package repositories on each of these. So we'll go ahead and just paste in these commands to install the necessary dependencies for the package repository for Kubernetes. I'm just going to kind of replicate these commands on each of the VMs. And then once we've got the package repositories configured, we'll just do an apt update on each VM to update our package caches. And now what we want to do is actually find an older version of Kubernetes that we can set up on our master node for starters. So how would we do that? Well, there is a command available, and they don't show it in the documentation here because they're just assuming that you're installing the latest version. But if you want to intentionally install an older version of Kubernetes, what you can do is call apt cache, and then there is a Madison command. And the name of the command is kind of weird, but if you run apt cache Madison and then kubeadm, that will actually print a list of all the historical versions of Kubernetes going all the way back to 1.5.7. So there's some pretty old versions there. Unfortunately, this command doesn't print the release date of the packages. It would be kind of helpful, in my opinion, if they did publish the release date, just so you could kind of see relatively when each of these versions was published. But unfortunately, we don't have access to that metadata, at least with this particular command. But what I'm going to do is find a version of Kubernetes that is a couple of minor versions old. So if I was going to set up a brand new cluster, I would probably be installing this 1.23.4 version just to make sure that I'm using the latest and greatest features. However, in this particular skill, we are intentionally trying to perform the upgrade process. So I'm actually going to set up an older version of Kubernetes on each of these worker nodes. We'll probably go with, let's say, 1.21.4, just as an example. Of course, you can use some older historical patch version here if you want to as well, but I'm just going to pick a random one and go with that, and then we'll actually run through the upgrade process. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and actually install the Kubernetes components and actually create the cluster itself. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.